member of the House of Representatives, very well versed in politics, and they picked him because he would balance that out. They didn't think that Schuyler Colfax could win the presidency, and he didn't have enough panache to win the presidency. They wanted somebody that could get people's attention. So they pick a political candidate in Ulysses S. Grant, who has no experience, and make up for it by having the guy run with him that has a lot. Good strategy, really, it's a pretty good move. Okay, so Schuyler Colfax was chosen as General Grant's vice presidential running mate, and he was the Speaker of the House of Representatives at the time. The Democratic Party countered with their presidential candidate. They picked Horatio Seymour, who was a wealthy former governor of New York. The Democratic Party countered with their presidential candidate, Horatio Seymour, who was a very wealthy former governor of New York. And once Seymour was given the Democratic Party nomination for president, he chose a former congressman by the name of Francis P. Blair Jr. of Missouri as his running mate. Pretty strong party. The Democrats had two really good politicians nominated. Actually better politicians than the Republicans did. So the Democratic Party chooses Horatio Seymour as their presidential candidate, a wealthy former governor of New York, and Seymour then chooses as his vice presidential running mate former Congressman Francis P. Blair Jr. of Missouri. Now, I'll give you a little side note on Blair. Very famous politician from Missouri. There's a house right across from the White House known as the Blair House, which is named in his honor, that Harry Truman stayed at when he was vice president, because Harry Truman was also from Missouri. He thought that was kind of cool. And whenever Harry Truman came to town after he was president, he always stayed in the Blair House. Okay, and if you are looking at the front of the White House right here, if I'm standing right in front, all I would do is look to my right, to the back, and at that corner I would see the Blair House. It's pretty cool. Named after that particular individual. Now, when the results came in, the popular vote was very, very close. And we all know that popular vote doesn't mean much. This last presidential election, certainly it did not mean anything. But the popular vote was pretty close. I would tell you that nearly 6 million people vote in this election. That was a high number for that time. People were interested, and so they went out to the polls. We had over 6 million people vote in the presidential election of 1868. And of those 6 million people that voted, General Grant won the popular vote by just 5%, or 309,000 votes. So it was very, very close in the popular vote. Grant wins by 309,000 votes out of 6 million, which is about 5%. But we all know that popular vote doesn't buy you much. It's electoral vote that counts. And in the Electoral College, it was a totally different story. Grant received 214 electoral votes in comparison to Horatio Seymour's 80. And with that victory in the Electoral College, 214 to 80, General Ulysses S. Grant becomes the nation's 18th president. Grant had 214, Seymour had 80 in the Electoral College. In the popular vote, 6 million were cast. Grant wins by about 309,000, or 5%. But he does what he needs to do in the Electoral College, and now we have a new president, General Ulysses S. Grant. And that's going to take us to our last subtopic of this test material, which is a profile on Ulysses S. Grant. And we'll keep in mind that he died on the same day that Aurora was born, and we'll tell you some more stories. Now, Megan, when you look on the ID sheet, the subtopic topic sheet, under Profile of President Ulysses S. Grant, what's the first identification name under that? No, it should be one. Oh, I didn't give you new sheets. Throw the old sheet away.
Whoa, there's a lot more names.
Yeah. So now, Megan, what's the name underneath that subtopic? First name. Hiram. Hiram Ulysses Grant. Anybody heard of that person before? So you want to guess who that is? We'll find out in just a second. Okay? Profile on President Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant was born Hiram Ulysses Grant on April 27th, 1822 in Point Pleasant, Ohio. All on your ID sheets, your new ones. Ulysses S. Grant was born Hiram Ulysses Grant on April 27th, 1822 in Point Pleasant, Ohio. He was born Hiram Ulysses Grant on April 27th, 1822 in Point Pleasant, Ohio. Because he is not Ulysses S. Grant yet, we will continue to call him Hiram Grant until we get to that point where he becomes Ulysses S. Grant. Well, Hiram Grant was the oldest of 6 children. He had 2 brothers and 3 sisters, and he was the oldest of the bunch. So Hiram Ulysses Grant was the oldest of 6 children. He had 2 brothers and 3 sisters. Now, when Hiram was 1 year old, the Grant family moved from Point Pleasant, Ohio, to Georgetown, Ohio, where Grant's father bought a tannery and also some farmland. So when Hiram Grant was just 1 year old, the family moved from Point Pleasant, Ohio, to Georgetown, Ohio, where his father purchased a tannery and he also bought some farmland. Does anybody know what a tannery is? Nobody knows what a tannery is? It's not where you get a tan. A tannery is where you would take animal hides and turn them into leather. Okay? He made leather coats, who knows what he made. But a tannery takes animal hides and turns them into leather products. Also had some farmland. Well, as a young boy, Hiram Grant was an excellent horseman, and he was so proficient with his horse that his dad often sent him on business trips for him, even though he wasn't very old. So he was an excellent horseman, and even though he was young, his dad often sent him on business trips for him because of his great proficiency with horses. Well, Hiram grew up in Georgetown. He went to elementary school there. He went to junior high, so to speak. Went to high school, and he graduated from high school in 1839. Graduated from high school in 1839. And his father was visiting around town, and he found out that his neighbor's son had just been kicked out, basically, of the United States Military Academy at West Point. He had been removed. So as Hiram's father is out and about, he finds out that their neighbor's son had been dismissed from the United States Military Academy at West Point. Well, Hiram's father saw this as a possible opportunity for his son. And so he contacted a local congressman and asked what the chances would be of his son filling the appointment of that boy that had been dismissed from West Point. So Hiram's father thinks that would be a good opportunity for his son. He gets a hold of a local congressman, and he asks this local congressman if he would appoint his son Hiram Ulysses Grant as a replacement for that young man that was dismissed. And what did the congressman do? Yes or no? He agreed. The only thing he did is he messed up the paperwork, and he sent Hiram's name in as Ulysses S. Grant. And Hiram was afraid that if he had a confusion in his name with the appointment and the papers and the application, he might not go in. So he legally changed his name to Ulysses S. Grant so there would be no confusion on his West Point application. Does that make sense? So it was from that point on that he went as Ulysses S. Grant, because the congressman made a mistake and put the name wrong on the appointment form. So the congressman agreed to put him into West Point, but a clerical error had listed him as Ulysses S. Grant, and not wanting to be rejected by West Point, Hiram Ulysses Grant changed his name legally to Ulysses S. Grant. Well, he was accepted to West Point, And historians will tell you that concerning his studies, he would be an average student. Nothing spectacular, nothing low, but pretty average. And we all know that average sucks. Thank you for remembering me that. Now, Ulysses wasn't a great student at West Point, obviously. He also received several demerits. Those are things when you don't do things right. What would get you a demerit? What do you think you got demerits for? Well, that's kind of, I mean, that's not quite, but close. How would you get demerit? How do you get demerits? What would be probably the most common demerit a person would get? No, not so much that. Not so much that. Not that violent. What do you get? What's a minor thing you get in trouble for? Not being on tardiness was one thing. Tardiness is one thing, and this other one might not surprise you after you think about his appearance at the surrender at the end of the Civil War. He got a lot of demerits for untidy dress. But that makes sense when you think about it. He shows up to the surrender in a private shirt and muddy boots. I mean, while General Lee's dressed up to the T, so he was kind of an untidy guy his whole life. And he received demerits at West Point for untidy dress and also for tardiness. Now, on the positive side of things, he did very well in mathematics. He did very well in geology, and he did very well in horsemanship during his studies at West Point. Did very well in mathematics, did very well in geology, and did very well in horsemanship. And as a result of his successes as well, he graduates from West Point in 1843. He graduates from West Point in 1843. And what is everybody interested in when you graduate from high school, for example? They want to know two things: your GPA and your class rank. Okay? Which is kind of a tough thing. But to let you know what kind of a student he was, there were 39 members of Grant's graduating class at West Point, and he ranked 21st out of 39. So he was a pretty average student. So Grant graduates from West Point in 1843. He ranks 21st out of a graduating class of 39. And what's the benefit of going to West Point? What do you come out as when you graduate? You don't start at the bottom, you come out as an officer. And his rank that he was given after his graduation was that of a second lieutenant. So he left West Point with the rank of second lieutenant. That's what he earned during the time that he was at West Point. So he graduates in 1843. He's 21st out of a graduating class of 39 and leaves West Point with the rank of second lieutenant. Well, what do they do to you next after you graduate? They send you somewhere, and they assigned him to the U.S. 4th Infantry Regiment, the U.S. 4th Infantry Regiment, which was stationed in St. Louis, Missouri. So Grant was assigned to the 4th Infantry Regiment, which was stationed near St. Louis, Missouri. Not all of you would be looking for this, but what did he find in St. Louis, Missouri? He found a woman. Yeah, he found his future wife, Julia Dent. Julia Dent. And he fell in love, and he actually proposed to her in 1844.
Holy crap.
So he proposes to her in 1844. People in those days didn't have a long courtship. They really did not. And he proposed in 1844. Now that doesn't mean they got married in 1844, because what happened to him is something was happening in American history in 1844 that would take him away from any marriage plans for at least 4 years. What was going on in history in 1844? Now don't let me down because the other bunch got it. What event in history that he would have got sent to militarily was happening in 1844?
Civil War.
Not yet. Go back. Not the Civil War. What? What'd you say? What was the war before the Civil War?
Revolution.
No, after that. After the War of 1812.
Oh, the War of 1812.
What, after the war? No, after the War of 1812, before the Civil War. In the Mexican War. That a girl. So, before the couple could wed, Grant was shipped off for duty during the Mexican War. And he served as a quartermaster. And a quartermaster is someone that keeps control and keeps a handle on the movement of supplies. So he served in the Mexican War as a quartermaster. That's someone that supervises the movement of supplies from one battle area to another. Now, we'll see how good you are, because we were drilling them all last period. He had the opportunity to serve in the Mexican War under two of the best generals possible that served our country in that war. Who did he serve under? No, this is the Mexican War. Generals. He wasn't a general in the Mexican War. He was a general of the militia. You're close. Who were the two generals? One was the overall commander of Union forces at the start of the Civil War. But he was elderly, and they had to replace him pretty quick. He's the one that offered Lee to be Winfield Scott. There you go. He served under Winfield Scott. And he also served under a general who also became a president, but wasn't very good at it because he had no political experience.
Ulysses S. Grant.
Well, he is the Ulysses S. Grant of 1844. Zachary Taylor. So, Grant served in the Mexican War under both Generals Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott. And he really learned from them. He studied their military tactics, their leadership skills, and did learn a lot from both men, which I think helped him be successful later in the Civil War. Well, after the Mexican War ended, and after a 4-year engagement, Ulysses and Julia were married in 1848, and in the next 6 years, they had 4 children. So they were married in 1848, and over the next 6 years, the couple had 4 children. But after the Mexican War was his service over, he continued to serve, and so he just doesn't get to go back to St. Louis. They assign him to another post, this time to Fort Vancouver in the Oregon Territory. And you don't get to take your wife and kids. And at this point, they had 1 son, and Mrs. Grant was pregnant with another son coming. So when he went to Fort Vancouver, he couldn't take his wife and infant son, and he would not see the birth of his second son because he will be serving his country in the Oregon Territory in Fort Vancouver. So the second son was born during the time he served there. Well, he's a human being. He became lonely. He became depressed, and it resulted in some pretty heavy drinking. So while he was at Fort Vancouver, because he was lonely for his wife and 2 children, one who he had not even seen yet, he becomes very lonely and depressed, which resulted in some pretty heavy drinking. Well, in the summer of 1853, he's transferred from Fort Vancouver to Fort Humboldt, which was off the coast of northern California. So he's transferred from Fort Vancouver in the Oregon Territory to Fort Humboldt, which was a fort on the coast of northern California. And again, his family was unable to join him at that post. Well, finally, on July 31st of 1854, after having several run-ins with his commanding officer at Fort Humboldt, Grant has had enough, and he resigns from the military and goes back home to St. Louis. So on July 31st, 1854, after having several run-ins with his commanding officer, Grant resigns from the military and returns to St. Louis. And we've heard that Ulysses S. Grant is this great man, which he turned out to be, but from the time he resigned in 1854 until the Civil War started in 1861 after the fall of Fort Sumter, he had a heck of a time surviving, and we'll tell you that story. First of all, when he gets back home, his father-in-law gives him a small farm to work. And after attempting that for a few years, it becomes a failure. He doesn't get the job done. It's an unsuccessful endeavor. So in St. Louis, Grant worked on a small farm that was given to him by his father-in-law, but this venture proved to be unsuccessful. After a few years, farm went under. Then he decided to go into the real estate business and failed miserably at that. He decided to go into the real estate business and failed miserably at that. He tried and was denied employment and other odd jobs, and finally he really was at the end's wit, and to support his family he began to cut and sell firewood on a St. Louis street. That's how bad it got for Ulysses S. Grant. He couldn't keep a job. He wasn't successful in anything he really did outside the military, and it got so bad that he had to cut and sell firewood on a St. Louis street. That wasn't even the worst. He tried doing that. And finally, he really had to swallow his pride. And in 1860, who did he ask for a job? Think about it. No.
Martin.
Who did he ask for a job? What would you hate to do as a... What? Even worse than that, you'd have to go back and ask who for a job. Not your father-in-law, but your father. He had to go and kind of beg a job from his father, who still owned the tannery business in Georgetown. Now, the humiliating thing is, who was his boss? Not his father, his two younger brothers were his